anxiety, nervousness, and a sheer terror of public speaking. So with the end goal in mind, what was I to do? I immediately engaged Jan Fox's help, and at this point she's got me as far as standing on stage. The rest is up to me, so let's see what happens. So, being British, as I'm sure many of you know, we don't particularly enjoy speaking about ourselves, so you can imagine how uncomfortable this is for me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, about my family, and about my sisters. I won't let the whole cat out of the bag, but at least you'll have a little sample. So I come from a long line of fairly sort of uptight people. This is my enjoying a picnic. My grandfather even wore a suit when he was gardening. I'm the 7th sibling out of 8. I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers. My brothers are absolutely fantastic people. They're both veterans, and they're just wonderful. We're such a close family. But at the end of the day, for as fabulous as they aren't sisters. We've got a terrific group of sisters in our family, and I just want to tell you a little bit about my life story with them. So, as I mentioned, I wasn't terribly perplexed. I knew that if I spoke about things that are near and dear to me, I'd certainly be able to get through this half hour or so. The family, big part of how I feel that I'm lucky in my life. I was walking on sunshine home as I came up, because I really do feel as if my entire life I've been very, very lucky. Sure, I've got things I could complain about, but it really wasn't the point. The way I look at life is, if you have a problem, you can usually solve it with some creative thinking. There's a couple of problems in life you can't solve, but at least you have a good shot at it. And that's sort of how I've always lived my life. And I think walking on sunshine is actually a great way to sum up my life. I've been very, very happy and very, very lucky. So I'll talk through a few things. There were certainly some very dark times in my life, which you'll hear about shortly. But on the whole, no complaints. Now, moving forward, I'd like to take you for a walk down memory lane. My parents got married just as World War II was winding down. My mum was English and my father was Scottish, and they ended up moving to Scotland, and that's where they lived, and they brought us all up. One of the things that happened was once we began having children, obviously I was the 7th, and by then 6 other siblings had already paved the way for me to come along. Which is a good job, because I think they really needed to be well prepared for me. One of the first memories I have, actually, was when I was about 4. We used to live in this house that overlooked some fields. And the field, I'd say it probably was about half a mile away before you got to the next home. But I decided at 4 that I really wanted to go across that field and see what was down there. So unbeknownst to my family, I took off and off I went, whilst they were all frantically looking for me. One of my sisters looked out the upstairs bedroom window and saw this head bobbing up through the wheat field. I was coming back home. I had a piece of string and a dog tied to it. Whose dog it was, it didn't matter to me because he was a cutie. But at that point, that's when I developed my love of travel. I just continued there one night. Excuse me 1 second. My first few weeks at school in Scotland were actually pretty exciting too. First day at school, within probably the first 5 minutes of sitting down, I met a lifelong friend of mine, and we've known each other ever since. But the other thing that happened in the 60s in Scotland is the transportation department was actually on strike. So this meant that I had to walk 1.5 miles each way uphill. Thankfully it wasn't snowing at that point. But we did have to actually walk to school for this first few weeks. Well, my eldest brother decided that we'd have a little bit of a change of plan. So as soon as we were out of the line of sight from the house, he put me in between his arms on his mod moped, and off we took down the street on this scooter. We just went herring down the street, and that's when I developed my love of very fast vehicles. Or as a sheriff once told me recently, it's not that I like fast vehicles, I just like driving cars fast. That's my problem. All over. So that was a pretty exciting time. Now, one thing, not much has changed really, has it? first day of school. And let me tell you, ladies, at 18, that outfit doesn't look any better when you're graduating. It doesn't look any better at all. Except I did actually have navy socks on instead. That was a little bit more slimming. Now, during the 60s and the 70s, my father's career at that point was like Mad Men on steroids. He was doing phenomenally well for himself and enjoyed a great deal of overseas travel. Almost to the point of, when I'm sure when someone asked him, when he would just ask about his family, he'd say, wife and kids? What wife and kids? So he really made the most of being away. This left my mother, who was an incredibly strong person, to bring up 8 children all by herself. At this point, too, also led to my father's decline into alcoholism. In those days, whenever they would go out, everyone would drink, and he certainly took part in that. Now, not everything was bad, but as you can see, what a motley crew. This is Christmas Eve for us, and you can see that not everything was rosy in the family. In the beginning of the 70s, Timex moved my father over to Portugal, which was a fantastic opportunity for him. He went over there to spearhead building a factory, and moved all of us over with him. It was a tremendously different lifestyle than the one that we led in Scotland. We had a phenomenal home. We had stables, we had horses, we had a swimming pool. It was just a fantastic lifestyle. But as you can see, one of the life lessons I learned very early in life is money cannot buy happiness. Not at all. So that's what we looked like then. Take a little look at the closer picture there of myself. I wasn't buying into that. I was chancing my arm, I was sticking out my tongue, and I had my foot on the furniture. That was definitely a sign of things to come. So about 3 years into our living just outside Lisbon, or rather as soon as we got there to Lisbon, my father had developed a love of all things French and decided to send all of his children to the French lycée. Well, not one of us spoke a word of French. Not one of us. Couldn't possibly have attended the British school. We couldn't have attended the American school, and so envious you did. But we went to the French lycée and off we went. So it was rather confusing for a 5- or 6-year-old. We spoke English at home, French at school, and Portuguese outside the home. Now I absolutely love that whole experience, and looking back on it, it was phenomenal. But it was pretty tricky as a kid, so the school life wasn't that great. One of the things that we did have, though, we had a chauffeur who took us to school every day. And en masse, I did remember some of my French, en masse we decided that we did not like the French cuisine for the school lunches. So all we did literally was have the driver come back, get us at lunchtime, and he took us down to the Ritz Hotel, where they had the best swivel seats ever. And I used to love going to lunches because we used to sit in these seats and spring round. We'd sign the check and off we'd go back to school. Completely different lifestyle, it's unbelievable. About 3 years into it, we ended up moving to the northern part of Portugal, in a city called Porto. And at that point, I had developed a love of horses, but there was really nowhere for me to go horseback riding. The closest place I found about a year later was about an hour away. Now, one of the things I didn't mention about my parents, when they were in the army, my father was a sergeant, and my mother used to drive ambulances. Well, she had a lifelong dislike of driving. Talk about being in the wrong seat on the bus. She really just didn't like doing that. So how else was I going to be able to go horseback riding an hour away? So, I was 10, and I decided I would convince my mother to let me leave the house in the summer at 6 a.m., take 2 trams, 1 bus, and walk for about a mile to get to these stables. Now, would I let a 10-year-old do that now? Absolutely not. But just keep in mind, my mother just did not know the force she was reckoning with. If I wanted to do something, I was going to do it. And so every morning in the summer, I'd get up at 6 and take those 2 trams and that 1 bus, and off I went horseback riding. That was the beginning of my independence streak. So all the while when we were living in Portugal, my father's descent into alcoholism at that point was getting pretty bad. We came back to Britain, roughly in the mid-70s after the coup in Portugal. And we ended up living in Yorkshire for a while. And then we went to Wales, and I ended up working at my high school years in Wales. That was actually a fun time. It's a very pretty place to live. When I was 18 and graduating, I actually had an offer to 4 different colleges. And me being had such itchy feet that I thought I couldn't possibly tie myself down for 4 years. What the heck? That's a lifetime. Well, from up here now, that's another lifetime. That was like 2 seconds. But at that point, I definitely did want to go to college. I wanted to strike out, I wanted to start working, and I wanted to travel. So, and at the same time, roughly, that's when my father's descent into that disease just spiraled out of control. There was no hope for me. So after 38 years of marriage, my mother divorced him, and she, my younger sister, and I moved over to Cambridge, where my eldest sister lived. And those were some of the happiest years there that we ever had. At that time, I decided that the minute we landed, it was time to look for a job. And again, had a luck place a hand in my life. The very first day I started looking, I got a job in a travel agency. How good was that for traveling? So I worked there for about 1.5 years or so, thoroughly enjoying the time I was spent there. Traveled as much as I possibly could. But then, after 1.5 years, I decided that I was a little bit more ambitious. I wanted a better job. So I went ahead and I applied to work for this Danish company who actually paid for tuition so I could go to college. And I had limited travel experience, but I could certainly do some traveling whilst I was there. So off I went, got this job, started to study, take exams, feet became itchy. And by the time I was 21, I visited 22 countries, including China and Russia, which at that point, going to China and Russia was fairly difficult, but you're determined you can do it. So, about 2 or so years into that, I decided it was time to come over and see the States. How was I going to do that? Well, I was fairly resourceful, and I decided that the way I could do it was actually to become a nanny. So I applied to this one family, and they accepted me. I didn't know anyone over here. Barely knew anything about America, because after all, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet by that point. And just knew what I could see and glean out of travel.